In this video, I'm going to show you how to splice together classical music. It's something that I'm assuming that you're a musician trying to do this yourself, and I'm going to run you through the basics, taking you from basically a beginner that you're very nervous, don't really know what to do, to being pretty confident about it and can really do it for real. So for choosing takes, I'm usually not the person to do this, but what I recommend that people do is go through and start with all the good stuff. Find all the moments where something went really well in one take versus another and get all of those lined up. Generally, if you can, start with just one whole good take. If you did a run through and you're like, yeah, that was generally pretty solid, start from there and then look from the other takes. If it's like, oh, this was definitely better, you know, we really nailed our intonation in that spot or whatever it might be. So start with the good things. And then from there, if there's anything that's, you know, bad or ugly, then cover up those spots and do some smaller edits to get rid of those. But start broad with generally what's good and just try to find, you know, good whole sections and then work your way into smaller increments from there if there's anything else that needs to be covered. While you're recording, always plan to give yourself plenty of leeway before and after the moment where you plan to put a splice. So if there's a big silence, really make sure that you're playing, you know, several bars before that big moment and there's a silence, and well into the silence. You want all of the sound to disappear from the room before you set the instruments down and make noise again. Ideally, you really wait a while and then start the next couple of bars for whatever the next section is and then cut off from there. So that way you also know the amount of spacing that felt right in the moment. When recording, always give yourself more than you need. Getting into the splicing, what do you want to listen for? You want to listen for things both on the short term and in the long term. So in the short term, you're listening for like the overall timing, like the rhythm, like the pocket, just the overall feel of where the cut happens. Sometimes it's awkward if the timing of the cut isn't quite right. Weird blips or pops or anything else coming in because the crossfade isn't happening at the best moment. So really listen for anything like or just like weird stutters or like, you know, if it sounds like somebody started the nose twice, like going da 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 or whatever it might be. Tiny volume changes where sometimes you might notice that it's forte and then it's at like a mezzo forte plus suddenly, and listening for those dynamic changes. You also want to listen to the timbre in the dynamic that kind of goes along with the volume changes, but timbre changes, that's a pretty dead giveaway that there's a splice there. The tempo changing, it's not quite as noticeable, but you notice, oh, something squirrely happened because suddenly we just got quite a bit faster. And then also the balance, that sometimes you in one take the cellist might be a little bit louder than the flute, in the other take they're about equal, and that balance suddenly changing be a dead giveaway that there's a splice. So those are the things that you really want to look out for. But you can usually just listen to a small moment and notice this, but I recommend listening to larger chunks to try to catch all of these, especially some of the longer ones like tempo is hard to catch just from listening to a small portion. So I'm going to demonstrate all of this, and I downloaded Reaper because it has a very long trial period, so you can potentially use this for your own project, and it is also generally pretty cheap. I think it's like $60 or something like that if you're just an individual using it. I've actually never used it before. It's the first time downloading it, so if you're nervous about trying to get it right, don't worry. I'm figuring it out too. It's pretty reasonable compared to other software such as Pro Tools. Anyway, so there's generally three types of splices that you're going to be encountering. One is the one that I mentioned earlier, but cutting on a big silence. You have a really big moment and then it gets quiet and then another moment comes in. And then the second is cutting on a hard attack where there's some sort of, you know, strong note, especially if it's some percussion, piano, or harpsichord as a really clear attack. Line it up and cut right where that attack happens. And it usually makes it pretty transparent. If all the other things I mentioned before are not an issue, it makes a very transparent cut. And then the last type that you can do, which you really want to try to avoid, is cutting on a sustain. That is the hardest to get right, and I would try to generally just try to avoid this as much as possible because it's pretty rare to get it completely transparent. Usually when you listen, you can still kind of hear it. A lot of times it ends up into different issues. So never plan on trying to do this, but it can work in a last resort. So I am going to try to see if I can make one work today, just so you can see. And maybe that'll just be to prove a point that it's very difficult. The four things that you want to play around with when you're making a cut. One is you want to play around with the length of the crossfade. Can make big difference in how transparent it is, the position that it's in, the overall shape, and then lastly, the timing of the clips. All right, so I have here the composer Carolyn Schubring with the ensemble Quartet Granitique. Looks like there's this big moment here. So this is like example number one, cutting on so there's big moment or whatever it might be. There's some silence. So what you want to be aware of here is any background noises as well as the way it starts. Yeah, I have a take starting that starts on the silence part. So I'm going to trim this one over. So it's kind of, we can see where the cello comes in, bring this over. I'm going to zoom in. Basically, I'm going to line up these visually. So I'm going to turn off the auto crossfade for a minute on Reaper, and I'm going to visually line these up. I'm looking at the kind of little V shape on each one, making sure that they line up pretty well. So like that's too far over and that's too far the other way. So right around there looks good. And then Reaper does the weird thing. So I'm going to get this so the crossfade's happening on the quietest moment. And let's see here. Turn on the auto crossfade, move it. And in silence, you can get away with a pretty long crossfade. Like this one's it's about half a second long. Now I see 228, 229. And that works great. That definitely works. There's nothing too strange. What you want to watch out for in something like that is going, you know, when you hear two inhales. So if we do something like this, then it doesn't work. So where you can hear the two breaths. But if I just undo all that and go back to where it was, there, nice transparent cut. And one of the easiest to do, kind of big moment and then cut. All right, so this one I'm gonna do kind of in an odd spot. I'm actually gonna pretend I'm gonna do it right where there's this little, was that an F sharp? Yeah, so right when the piano plays that F sharp, I'm gonna cut it right on that F sharp. So I found it, whoop, right there. And then this one, there's that F sharp again. Again, you can kind of see just by looking at it. So I'm gonna kind of just trim it to there just so it makes it easier. Scooch this over and put my cursor here so it zooms in on where I want. All right, so right here is the F sharp and right here is the F sharp. So to make it easier, I'm gonna trim this back even more. Do that again just to double check. Okay, yep. Okay. So again, the method is the same. I'm going to turn off the auto crossfade and just visually line these up, drop it, and then I'm going to turn the auto crossfade back. And then this is where the crossfade length and shape really matters. So this I can already guarantee is not going to work for various reasons. One, I'm looking at it and it's just way too long of a crossfade, and two, where the where it's positioned is definitely going to ruin it. So very obviously that's problematic because the note is doubled. That's not going to work. So we'll have to try this again. Basically start this one from scratch. Find that F sharp again. Yep, right there. Okay, I'm going to make sure that they're lined up really well. That way it takes timing. The timing should work out well because it's just from the one take to the other. And then I'm going to crossfade. And then the trick that I find for this is look for the dips. So what I mean by the dip is if I'm in here, so like all of this you could kind of see as a dip, but I'm really talking about like right here, getting the crossfade on like the quietest moment before the sound starts growing it. So getting it so the crossfade is done. So a proper crossfade is like this. So this is what generally you're going to be seeing, where the crossfade is done by the time this attack of the second note, the attack of the new take starts. So I generally want it to fit the kind of overall shape of the dip. So I'm looking and kind of goes down, and kind of like right here, there's like a small dip sort of thing. If you're kind of looking, it just want to keep it pretty short. So in here, I can see that it looks like these lines are a half of a second, and you generally want to be like, for something like this, 20 or 30 milliseconds. So I'm looking, and something like this is probably going to work well, but let's see. Whoop. So here we go. This one's a little problematic because you can hear that sudden dip in volume right where the crossfade happens. So this is where there's different programs can work on this, but it looks like with Reaper, you just double click on it and there's a crossfade editor. And let's see here. So it gives you this shape, and I'm going to pick a stronger shape on each. Yeah. So basically you can go where it's each one you can see is like a perfect X, and then messing around. Let's see here. So kind of going with one that's got a stronger bump so the volume is more even on each. Let's see here. Okay, let's hear how that sounds. Much better. But there's still a dip in volume. Let's see, let's try making this even smaller. So I usually find like 20 or 30 milliseconds. So I'm going to really kind of zoom in, and I'm just going to put it right before the note. So a lot of times getting the right timing. So kind of as a visual cue, you can see here, like that's, 500 milliseconds, so like half a second. And we're just kind of go super small, zoom out a little bit and take a listen. I think you can get away with that. Knowing that the slice is there, I can definitely hear it. But that being said, yeah, I think that works. So for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to try to crossfade on this held note. So on this moment, if I put a crossfade here, you can kind of hear like the timbre suddenly gets all kind of nasally and strange. Right on the crossfade, the timbre gets strange. And that's just when you have the overlap and they're not combining well, which is going to be usually the case. It's pretty rare for it to just kind of be able to put a longer crossfade and actually have it work. A lot of times the frequencies ending up conflicting more than they end up adding up. And so you end up with phasing issues is what it's called in audio. Let's see if I can actually get cutting on this note to work, but it's going to be very difficult. So going too long definitely creates some sort of phasing. What happens if I go really short? So it sounds like they re-articulated kind of. So that doesn't work going too short. So from there, we're just going to have to play around with the position. So let's see here. Let's see if I can make it work right at the very end of the note, because naturally is a change in timbre at the end of the note. So let's see if this works. So yeah, it happens right before the note change. I can even go a little bit before. So it's a little noticeable that you can kind of hear like a whoa sort of thing going on. But let me see if I can, let's bump these up to the next slope. Whoop. So there, I feel like it's actually less noticeable because now there's kind of a bump in volume. That's pretty close to actually being able to work. Again, this is why you want to avoid cutting, trying to put a splice on a held note, because there's just the differences are often too obvious and the phasing becomes really noticeable. I think right there, it actually does work that there's a slight phasing and volume adjustment, but it kind of, I'm hearing it as being part of the note change. But if I really wanted to make this a better, my instinct would be to go where there's this dip here, basically right where that note change is happening. And let me zoom out and let's take a listen to that. Think that works better. Yeah, and I'm not hearing like any doubled clicks from the clarinet keys or anything like that. I think all in all, it's just, this actually works. So to recap, you want to try to avoid splicing on longer held notes because it's going to make it much more difficult. You want to try to aim to either be cutting on clear defined notes or ideally on longer silences. Longer silences, it's going to be quieter. It's going to be harder to hear. Putting a crossfade on a quieter moment, it tends to hide it a little bit more. Giving yourself flexibility when recording so that we have time. If a certain note just really isn't working, try cutting on a different note, can really make a difference. And then playing around with the length of the crossfade. If you're going too long, it can be too transparent, and going too short, sudden, there can be sudden changes and it can be a little bit jerky. So finding that right length. Usually when cutting on a hard note, the shorter the better. But I find really just kind of matching where there's like a little dip or getting it right before really works. Cutting during the silence is always the easiest. It's the only one that I feel like I can really guarantee, yes, I can make something happen during that moment, as long as nobody's making too much noise. Cutting on a hard attack is the one that you have to do the most, and it's generally pretty doable. You can't always guarantee that you're going to be able to do it. And then cutting on a sustained note is really what you want to try to avoid doing. Not that it's impossible, but it's going to be the hardest to do. With all of these, just take the time to experiment with it. The things that you really want to play around with is the length of the crossfade is very big, but also the crossfade position. Generally, longer crossfades are more likely to cause some sort of volume dip, but it can work sometimes doing a longer crossfade, especially on more quieter moments or like fade outs or anything like that. The shape and slope can really help when you are doing a longer crossfade. And then lastly, the timing of the clips. Sometimes it just sounds weird because you didn't quite line it up. You can eyeball it, but just again, play around with the timing of the clips as well. And last, the things to look out for is just basically any changes, especially doubled attacks, changings in the timing, tempo changes on more longer listenings, sudden strange sounds, tone, it really can change right on the crossfade as well. And the overall balance is another big thing to look out for. I think that covers it. Let me know how it goes. Feel free to put questions down in the comments. I will try to get to them and answer if I can. There's only so much I can do in a YouTube comment, but please let me know if this was helpful and of any questions that you might have. I'm happy to help, and best of luck on your journey.